All right, let's get started. It looks like almost everybody's in. So, so tonight what we want to do is really papers 1 and 2 are by far the hardest. Everybody says that. I give you more time on them, and we'll have some sessions to try to help you out. The real key is to read, and while you're reading, decide what you're going to do. So you have to figure out how you're going to organize, because if you spend 6 hours of reading and at the end of that 6 hours you got this mess, not organized, then you're going to create more time. So you need to, as you're reading, be thinking about how I'm going to organize this. And that's why I'm giving you Porter tonight, is Porter is a really good way to organize it. So let me start with a high level Porter, and then we'll go do detailed Porter. So, all right. And y'all interrupt me. This should be a pretty interactive class, more than probably your other classes. So, all right, so here's the Porter 5 forces. So your first paper, Nikolai was just asking about the first paper. So your first paper, you have an intro where you define your industry. I was just talking about that with Max. You want to define your industry as clearly as possible. And here's how, in those groups I set up, you have some peers that are doing similar companies. So like Lululemon and Nike, are they in the same industry? Nike does more shoes, Lululemon does more clothing, but you got to define that. So for retail, we're just talking about that with Procter and Gamble. Do they actually have brick and mortar buildings, or are they selling to people who are the front to retail? So who are they, to whom are they selling? Try to define the industry as clear as you can. For papers 1 and 2, you want your industry as specifically defined as possible. We'll switch that when you get to papers 4 and later. We'll actually be using a much broader definition, but you really on paper 1 want to get as specific as possible. So a good example is the restaurants. I wouldn't put Darden in with McDonald's. And that's why I was telling Miranda, I really like that Chipotle paper, because he does a really good job of saying, okay, these are restaurants where you sit down and dine, but you stand in line getting your food. Here's the restaurants that are fast food, a lot of drive-through. Here's the restaurants you sit down, you have someone that comes to your table and takes an order. You know, so he's different. He had different terms for each one of those, and he defined that up front. So not only define your interest, your industry, you contrast to what is not your industry. And what I talk about here in this part of the paper is you define your industry, and someone says, well, is Costco in that industry? They should know right away whether Costco belongs or not. So if you define your industry as we're a retail outlet that sells stuff, then they say, well, does that include Amazon? Well, not really Amazon, because they don't have brick and mortar. Well, then you need to get that brick and mortar in your definition. But then you say, well, brick and mortar, well, Walmart is, I don't know if y'all noticed, Walmart is trying to compete with Amazon Prime now. Well, Walmart does a lot of online. Does that kick Walmart out? Best Buy has been doing an enormous amount of online. So you kicking Amazon out because they have brick and mortar, or you're going to keep Walmart in because they have a lot of online. Costco, I don't think, has a very good online presence. So you have to define that really clearly. If you want to have Amazon in there with Walmart and Costco, then make sure your definition says that. So be really clear, those that are doing the apparel stores, be really clear if you're talking about athletic shoes or athletic clothes or clothing, apparel. Are you going to have American Eagle in there with Lululemon, or are you going to really make it an athletic? So be real clear on that definition. I'd recommend that if you're struggling with your definition of your industry, you know, Market Line can certainly help you with that. But even call me. I'm pretty good at the only industry I struggle with is tech, because I'm not a tech person. But I can do my best. I've read enough papers, so I'm getting a little bit better idea on how the semiconductor is broken up in some of these other industries. But you know, if you want to just brainstorm with me and just call and see if we can get a good definition.
Professor Street?
Yes?
Hello?
I'm here.
I was wondering about Lululemon. Would we consider that like a lecture item for a paper, or more like the athletic side?
Well, it's up to you to decide. I've never bought their product before. I've always thought of that as a little bit higher end, maybe a little bit of a branding type of company for athletic. Not necessarily athletic like Nike, but athletic as far as exercise. But I really don't know. I've never been. Do they have stores, or they only sell in other stores?
No, they have stores, yeah, but they're usually in with next to higher brands.
Okay.
Like, yeah, like you could see Louis and Gucci next to Lululemon and some other weird.
Yeah, I don't think them in the same category as Gucci. I don't really know. Boy, I buy my stuff at Walmart, so I don't know. I'm as unfashionable as you can get. But MarketLine can help because they'll help kind of put it together. If we had well, a good way of thinking, you can Google and just Google who are Lululemon's major competitors. There's a lot of websites that actually have competitor lists. In fact, Yahoo Finance will show who the competitors are. They're not always really good lists because they may put firms together that you wouldn't consider, but it gives you some ideas. But I think the real key is you're leaving the house to buy the product they sell. What is on your list? Where are you going to go? And that should really drive it. We'll get a little bit into that Thursday night when we talk economic moats and differentiation. We might get into it tonight with Porter as well. All right. So yeah, good question. The next thing you do is you give some definitions and kind of the outlay of the industry. And is it a concentrated industry? Is it very competitive? We'll get it. You don't want to get too far ahead on the porters. If you look at some of the discussions in the student examples, here's what they talk about. You define your industry and this is what it is. This is what it's not. And then it talks about the players. You can definitely talk about the major players. Be really careful in this part that you don't start talking about your company. If your company's a major player, you just limit it to that perspective. You don't want to make this a paper 3. So definitely can talk in those lines. Some students do a little bit of a history. That can help. History doesn't always help. So if I were doing Netflix, I think a history of Netflix would make a lot of sense. Competing with Blockbuster and then mailing CDs and then doing online, digital, and then going to production, and then talking about the new players coming in, how competitive it's getting, and how it's becoming more production. Part of that history, I forget who's doing Netflix, but so Jacob, part of that history, I think Netflix for the first time has gotten some Emmy nominations or even Oscar nominations. I'm not sure, but I seem to remember hearing something about that. That's pretty unique. That someone like them would get. I know maybe the Music Channel and some of these others have something like that, but it's pretty unique. So they're definitely changing, and their competitors are changing. You see Disney, AT&T, Apple. So it's so that part of the history can really work. You're trying to set your boss up to understand where you're going on whether or not this is a good industry to be in or not. And so that if that history shows, wow, this industry is changing rapidly. That really works. Now, if I'm doing Procter and Gamble, I don't know if I need a 100-year history of toothpaste, and it doesn't make sense to me. I might just focus on the major players over time. Maybe there's been some mergers, but that kind of thing. But keep it at the industry level. But those type of things. So what you do in the introductory side, it varies all over the place. It really depends on your industry. But let's get into Porter, and then what you'll do is you'll just say now I am going to do a Porter analysis. Why? So why are you doing Porter analysis? So that's really key. I think what I grade off really hard on the first paper are students who do aimless Porter analysis. Hey, my professor told me to do Porter, so I need a sick Porter here. You got to change your mentality. You're no longer a college student. You're a finance professional. So why are you doing Porter? So you're trying to assess industry growth prospects. That's the whole purpose of Porter. Is this an industry that is going to grow well, or is this an industry that has growth issues? All right. One thing you can do to set that up if you want to before or after, you could actually talk about growth in the history. So how could you do that? If you look at the file for paper 4, there is a page in there called Bloomberg dump data or something like that. It has a revenue line for everybody I put in your industry. If you need help with that, I can show you. But you could certainly take all the companies I put into your industry and you could create a file that looks at their growth over time. You could probably find something in Statista, but you might want to show some historical growth. So, hey, you know, Facebook, you're talking about online advertising, Facebook and Google. My word, the growth rates have been 30, 40, 50%. But is that growth rate starting to slow the last few years? Can they really keep that going? So that can really help to give a greater perspective before you get into Porter. So you can see this industry has been growing really, really fast, but now I want to change my perspective and look at their future growth prospects by doing a Porter analysis. All right. Any questions on that? How you set this up? And I don't know if Nikolai, this is helping you with Nikolai. If this is helping you with somewhat of a rubric. Okay.
It's certainly helpful. Thank you.
So now we get the buyer power. Now, this is one of my pet peeves. Students like to do buying power and they say strong, and I don't like that. I don't think your boss will like that either. When I see that, I don't know if that means the buyer power is strong, which is bad for the industry, or the buyer power is weak, which is good for the industry. So what I like are terms like favorable or positive for industry growth, something like that. Make it really obvious whether it's positive for your industry or negative for your industry. So buying power is positive for industry growth because, and we'll talk about those buying power things. And then what I recommend at the very end, and the other thing I really count off on the end of the Porters is the summary. And what I strongly recommend, I don't think there's many students have done this. There's a couple of them in the examples that have. And I beg students every semester to do this, and for some reason, no one's listening. So hopefully y'all are listening right now. But I think a matrix works really, really well here. So you have a matrix that lists buyer power, supplier power. You have a second column that has a real quick summary. The most important thing from each one of those, and the last column that says whether it's favorable or negative for industry growth, and then an overall assessment. Okay, so essentially there's your papers 1 and 2. Okay, a question? Maybe I'll make a pretend matrix. Maybe I'll go back and look one of the students' papers and I'll make a matrix so I can show you. It's pretty, you can tell what I'm talking about. So a lot of students really do very weak summaries. You've done all this work on Porter analysis and I read it, so well, that's really interesting. Then I come to the end and it's like, well, so what? What does it mean? And the students don't tell me. So you got to bring it all back together, and that's and not the you know, just to give you the reality of this industry. Your summary is probably the only thing your boss will read anyway. So does that mean you waste your time on all this? Well, no. You have to do all of this in order to create the summary. So your boss may not really read this all that closely. I will be reading it closely, but your boss may not. Your boss may jump right to there. But he or she wants to know that you've done all of this work, all right? So essentially, this is a pretty high level of papers 1 and 2. Paper 1 is you know, industry-related issues. Paper 2 are macro-related issues, but they still fit in here. So we'll talk about that as we go through Porter. How do you bring in the paper 2? So you don't have to separate papers 1 and 2. You write them as one big paper, but you just make sure as part of papers 1 and 2 that you have macro analysis type of stuff in there. If you're not sure if something's macro analysis or industry analysis, you know, talk to me and we can agree among ourselves that, yeah, I'll count. I think a minimum wage is a paper 2 item. And minimum wage fits where? Right there. Minimum wage issues. Employees are part of your supply. They supply labor to you. Minimum wage is an issue there. Union labor is a supplier power issue. And so I see both of those as being macro economic type of issues from paper 2, and so they fit in really, really well there. Same thing with raw material prices. We'll come back to this maybe more on Thursday. But raw material prices. So if you're doing Nike and Lululemon and they buy a lot of cotton, that fits in there. You're doing Starbucks, they buy coffee. How are coffee prices doing? And you might even do some analysis of coffee prices versus what Starbucks charges. How stable are Starbucks gross margins? When input prices fall, do their gross margins rise, or do they actually cut their prices and pass some of that on to their consumer? All right, so any questions about the overall structure of papers 1 and 2? We'll look at the, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was asking if you could just scroll up. I missed the introduction.
So intro. So you need to define your industry up front. Definitions and overview of the industry. That's the most generic thing. I don't know what to tell you on that because it's going to vary by every industry. Major players, don't get carried away with that. Major players. Let me mention something on major players. And Nikolai, I'm glad you asked me that. Anything you can do to summarize the contrast, I think is really, really good. I've not seen that except for in a couple of papers. So you talk about the major players, but if you can somehow in a matrix, say some random is talking about Lululemon, is there a way to contrast Lululemon to Adidas and Nike and these others? You know, this gets back to what we're going to talk about, differentiation. So that's the Porter generic strategies of differentiation, cost leadership, and focus are good. This is a good place to put those in, and we'll talk about those more on Thursday, I think, but this is a good place to put those in. So your industry, how does it differentiate itself? If there's one player who's really the cost leader, and there's other players that differentiate themselves, how do they differentiate themselves? Nike, maybe it's through advertising. It's how they advertise. It's the sporting people that they hire, you know, whether it's Tiger Woods or whoever. Lululemon, it might be, I don't know how Lululemon gets to its clientele, but it might be word of mouth or whatever. But, you know, that's a good thing to draw into that part of it. So is there a way you can upfront define your industry players, how they distinguish themselves from each other? Now somebody's doing Delta, right? I forget who took on Delta. So Shamir,
yes,
Delta's going to be tough. But you know, I always ask. You know, sometimes it's easy. Why do you pick United versus Spirit? Well, Spirit's cheap. So obviously there's the budget airlines. But how do you pick United over Delta? And Shamir, I just noticed they're starting to do they're starting to drop their change fees.
Yeah, I saw that there was an article on the Wall Street Journal that came out today or yesterday, I think.
And what do you notice when one does it? What happens? Everybody does it, right? So
Yeah.
How do you differentiate an industry like that? I don't, you know, most people will say I distinguish between United and Delta based on price. I tend to do it based on, you know, how good their schedule is, but there's not much more. I don't know anybody says I go to Delta because they have much better service. I don't really care. I'm on the plane for 4 hours and just get me there safe and I'm happy. I don't care if they, you know, don't give me a drink or whatever. So that's the kind of thing you think about. The way I do it is, why would I go to this company versus another company? Or what are the type of people that go to this company versus another company? That's really powerful to put up early. If you can do it in a matrix, again, some way to find to summarize it, I'd give a lot of bonus points for that. Find some ingenious way to bring it all together rather than your boss having to read 4 or 5 pages of stuff. Okay, here's this company, here's what they do, here's what they do. And you're like, are they different? They all do the same thing. How do they distinguish them? And so just like we mentioned with, you know, how do you distinguish between Procter and Gamble and Unilever? And there are some distinct strategy differences between those two. All right, and then some history on the industry if it makes sense. If you want to set up the Porters by talking about historical growth, that would make sense. And then we'll get into Porters, which is what we're going to do next, get into the details of Porter. All right, any other questions?
Professor Sweet, where would you incorporate like unionization and stuff like that? Would that be in suppliers?
Under suppliers, yeah. Anything related to workforce.
Okay.
You know, everything that Uber and Lyft are going through right now in California, I would put that under supplier power.
Okay.
All right, let's look at Porter, and we'll come back to this. I'll give you ideas on each one of these, what you can do. Substitution threats is actually one of the tougher ones to really figure out what is a substitution. So a good example, Procter and Gamble, there may not be a substitution threat. You know, people aren't going to substitute something for toothpaste probably. So, you know, some industries you won't, and that's key. Remember this, get this in your notes. Even though there's 5 forces in Porter, you don't have to have 5 equal sections. And you can, one section like substitution threat, you can just say, I don't really think this applies to my industry, and you're done. And then you focus all your energy on something else. So don't waste time trying to build, you know, 4 or 5 paragraphs on substitution threats for Procter and Gamble. I just don't, you know, in my opinion now, he may disagree with me. Max may disagree and say there is a substitution threat, but it's hard for me to envision it, you know. So almost all of you will have significant buyer power and supplier power. That's just for every industry. And rivalry within the industry and exit entry barriers, you know, you'll at least say something about substitution threats, the one that may not apply to every industry. All right, y'all ready for me to go into Porter now? Let's bring up the PowerPoint. The PowerPoint is out there on the Blackboard. I'm not going to put it in screen show because I lose access to seeing who's speaking. But so let's start with this second chart. So on the second chart, here's Porter's 5 forces. You'll notice it's expressed so many different ways. What I like about some of these that are like, well, I tell you what, I better go on the screen shows slideshow because it's a little too small here. What I like about these is hard to tell here, but you'll notice under here there's a lot of subcategories. What I would do with those subcategories, and they're fairly well defined because Michael Porter is he's a very detailed guy, and his lists are always the same. So, and you notice in Market Line they go through that list. That's a list I would look at to give you ideas, not a list to replicate. Don't say, okay, I got to talk about the 7 things under buyer power, the 8 things under buyer power. Instead, look at that list and see if it gives you ideas of things to talk about. Right? You can actually ignore the sub list in your paper and just talk about buyer power as one topic, but definitely go through the list and see. You may not be able to see it on this screen, but if you pull it to PowerPoint, you can, you know, spread this out. I probably got this picture off of Google Images, so there's millions of these pictures out there. So under each one, there's things to talk about. So these are the 5 groups that define, again, the attractiveness of an industry related to growth. Is this an industry that's going to be growing, or is this an industry that is shrinking? The second part of Porter is the generic strategies. And he has broad, and he doesn't call it narrow, he calls it focus. There's cost leadership and there's differentiation. Differentiation, we'll talk some about what kind of categories there are differentiation. Is it marketing? Is it the product itself? Is it service? Those type of things. And then focus. Focus can either be cost or differentiation. So like Spirit Airlines is a focus on cost because they may be become national, but some of the regional airlines are more focused on cost in certain markets. This is more paper 3 where you're trying to identify how your firm fits in. But what I was talking about, the introduction to paper 1, you're trying to define the industry. Does your industry have an obvious cost leader? Does your industry have obvious ways firms differentiate themselves? Are there focused players in your industry? Are there players who focus on a really small part of the market? And, you know, maybe they're growing or not, you know, that kind of thing. And how are they doing? So this is a good way to help define your industry. So again, you don't want to talk about your company specifically. You want to ask, does your industry fall into this Porter definition? In some industries, you know, Unilever versus Procter and Gamble, I have a tough time understanding who's the cost leader. And Lululemon and Nike, you know, boy, I don't know who the cost leader is. Maybe it's Walmart. Who knows? But, you know, think through it. Porter says there's only one cost leader in any industry. I'm not really sure that's true, but you know, there's usually one obvious one. Most people, when they think airlines, they think Southwest Airlines. I'm not sure that's necessarily true anymore, so you have to really think through it. All right, so that's a good way to think about it. And then the last thing he does is he has his value chain. And I'm not asking you to do a value chain in this paper, but value chain, make sure in your notes, value chain, if you do discuss it, it's a paper 3 topic. It's a company specific topic. However, you can find value chain analysis of industries. And you can Google that, and that can give you a lot of good ideas. Now, if you want to do a value chain analysis in your paper, that's perfectly fine. I do give, extra points for, students that show some good critical thinking. That's one way you could do it, is to bring in another analysis like this. And you can find good value chain analysis. Let me show you value chain analysis a little more up front. So the value chain analysis says there's things that firms do. Now, Porter did this many, many years ago. I doubt any of y'all have done value chain analysis in your classes. Has anyone ever seen value chain analysis in a class? Not hearing any yeses. So it sounds like
not in depth.
Not in depth, maybe high level. Maybe this is probably the same level. So
It's
Porter
pretty
wrote
common.
this. I'm sorry?
I'm sorry. It's pretty common for investment committee Miranda and stuff.
Yeah, I think you're seeing it more. I didn't notice it as much when I was an analyst, but I think you're seeing it more now. But I don't know why it's. Porter wrote this a long time ago, so I actually just read his book on value chain and where he set this up, and it was an interesting book.
Maybe not like that specific Porter value chain, but something like it. It's usually in there.
Well, you have the supply chain and you have the value chain. And the supply chain is part of the value chain. The supply chain is the inbound logistics. So what Porter said, I think is an interesting idea. I do like the way he thinks. I think he gets a little overly detailed, and so he's a little dry to read. But his idea is firms do stuff. And the stuff they do either defines them as far as their cost. They do things like economies of scale to make them cheap, or they do stuff that differentiate them. And usually when they do differentiating thing, it usually increase their cost. So you can't, essentially his argument is if you're focused on differentiation, your costs will be higher. If you're focused on economies of scale, you're going to be focused on cost and you won't be all that differentiating. And it's the value chain that does it. And so he talks about it. There's the inbound logistics. That's getting your supplies. That includes labor, hiring, those type of things, although hiring might be part of human resources. But it's your inbound. Where do you get your raw materials? Then it's the processing. You take those raw materials and you create something. So it gets a little tough when you're talking about a consulting firm. Then you have your outbound logistics. You have the final product and it's ready to be sold. You put it in the distribution. You have your marketing and sales. And then after the fact, you have service. And what he says, firms throughout this drives cost and this drives differentiation. And you want to understand how is your firm unique in each one of these things in terms of cost. Now, Walmart, inbound logistics, they're probably pretty cheap on inbound logistics. But you might want to think about that. What exactly does Walmart do to get stuff into their stores? That's the supply chain analysis. We talk about them sourcing from China, but how do they actually do it? How do they find this stuff to sell in their stores? Who gets shelf space? Those kind of things. So you can see how deep you could go into some of these. If I were doing Walmart or Costco or HEB, to me, supply chain analysis would be probably the single most important thing. I think that's where those stores really gain their cost advantages. So I would try to find something in their annual report or do a search on supply chain analysis. Other firms, it's marketing. So Nike, unfortunately for Nike, it's hard to find information on their marketing. I wish you could look and see what their marketing budget is as a percentage of revenues over time. I've never been able to find that. So Sergio and Marcus and Hector and Andre are doing Nike. Maybe try Capital IQ. I could not find anything in your report that says how much they spend on marketing. It might be such proprietary information they don't want to share it. But on that, I think their biggest part of their value chain is the marketing and sales. But you look at each one of these, and then there's these kind of support activities, the infrastructure, management, finance, legal, planning, human resources, their technology. I heard a podcast not too long ago, and I thought it was really interesting. He said, going forward, every firm will be a software company. That's all that matters going forward. It's your software. How good are your programmers? Because that's how you gain access to your customers. So how strong is their technology? And then procurement. Procurement's he's got it right next to inbound logistics. Obviously, those two are closely tied to each other. And then he talked about differentiation. He said differentiation How do you differentiation yourself? Now, this was interesting. He said there's two ways differentiation works. Either you reduce your buyer's cost or you improve your buyer's performance. So you do something your buyer used to do this, used to cost them $50, and you're not going to do it. It's only going to cost them $30. Or your buyer used to do this and it took them 10 hours and it was just frustrating, and now you can do it in 30 minutes. And so you're improving performance. So it's just another way to think about the world through the value chain analysis. I would at least stop and think about it, look at it, consider it for your firm, and that will help you, I think, with the differentiation. Where in this value chain does your firm really excel? Where do you think they're weak? Are they doing things to improve those type of things? So like outbound logistics, I would include the internet there. Walmart bought jet.com. Y'all can't do Walmart, but what is your firm doing on the internet? No one's doing Best Buy, but I found it interesting that Best Buy sales on the internet have really shot up dramatically. What exactly are they doing? Is it just because of COVID-19? All right, any questions on the value chain? One thing he does, this might be overkill, but anyway, when he talks about the cost drivers in the value chain, he has 10 of them. I thought this was a little overkill. He goes in detail on each one of these, but it might give you some ideas. Is economies of scale important to this firm? Is learning? You're doing a firm like NVIDIA, someone is doing NVIDIA. Learning is a big issue for NVIDIA. They do things that they've been doing it for a while that they know better than anybody else, and they just learned it extremely well. Capacity utilization. How much capacity, this is a big issue for airlines right now. Obviously, they've got a lot of planes just sitting idle. But what capacity do they have that's not being used? And what could they do with it? So you can see as you go through there, what Porter does and why he's so well liked is he helps you think about the problem in a way, it gives you ideas to find things no one else is thinking of. So don't feel like, some students, they become catatonic in this class because I give them so many things and they feel like they got to do every one of these and they can't. So I'm not telling you do every single one of these things, but I'm giving you some ideas that will help you. You're trying to figure out the biggest issues for an industry. Try each one of these for a few minutes, sit there, think about it, see if it jogs some things about the firm. Google these terms for your firm and see if you get something that comes up that someone else has some good ideas to help you try to figure out your firm and your industry for these first three papers. But let's get into Porter. So he's talking about industry attractiveness and profitability. So here's his 5 forces. Threats to industry. So threats to new entrants. So here what you're talking about is how easy is it for a new player to come in? And we'll talk about that when we talk about economic moats. That's a closely related term. But threats to new entrants. So restaurants, threats to new entrants, it's extremely unattractive to that industry. It's very easy for a new restaurant to start. There's new ones starting all the time, and they kind of have, the newness of factors, so they get a lot of new business, and then they get old and boring, and people drop out. So, so that's for you doing the restaurants, Starbucks and BJ's. That's most people say that's negative for the industry. It's very easy to come in. Aerospace, that's a strong favorable for the industry. Why? Because there's so much property, plant, and equipment. You have to have contracts with defense, with the government, and the government doesn't do business with just anybody. You got to be big. You got to be a major player. Have to have a history. Makes it really hard for a new player to jump in. Auto manufacturing, Tesla is pretty amazing. A new auto manufacturer doing as well as Tesla's doing is pretty amazing. It's a very difficult industry to come in and just start a new business with. So that's threat of new entrants. So just in your mind, think about if you were to start a firm in this industry from scratch, how difficult would it be to do? So Procter and Gamble and Unilever, their huge benefit that they have is they have shelf space. So when you go in the grocery stores, H-E-B, Walmart, they have certain places that they put those products because they know they're popular. In fact, Walmart got in trouble a few years ago where they started pushing their own Walmart brands. and Procter and Gamble and Unilever and Colgate got really mad at them for pushing their brands more at eye level. It's like, no, you need to put our brands where we want them. So that's a barrier to entries. Airlines, obviously, barrier to entry. You have to own all these jets. Ecolab, a barrier of entry is you have somewhat a monopoly on that industry. I don't know if y'all have looked into that, Richard and Christy. My impression with Ecolab is they're so good at what they do that they have somewhat of a dominance in the industry. And you think about that. Think about an entry. It's a barrier to entry can be related to buyer. So one of the things Porter says on their buyer is buyer incentive. So you think about the buyer of something like Ecolabs. You have this purchase procurement manager, and he or she has always bought from Ecolab, and suddenly they say, you know, I'm going to save 2 cents and buy from them, and it doesn't work out, and they look like a fool. And you know, a lot of times these firms have a huge advantage because of switching. We'll talk about switching costs. That's a big entry barrier. If the buyer for a firm were to actually switch to another provider and it didn't go well, that causes them all kinds of headaches. And a lot of times people will stick with a firm like Oracle and not switch to Salesforce just because they don't want that hassle if it doesn't work out. So, you know, think about the buyer, especially if your buyer is a corporation, and think about that from an entry-level threat to entry, new entrants. Any questions on threats of new entrants? That should probably be in all of your papers. That's a pretty common one to talk about. How easy is it to start a new business? Jacob, I don't know if you're on the call, but you know, Netflix is trying to build a barrier to entry by all the billions that it's spending on production. It's trying to create a war chest. Disney already has that available, so that kind of offsets some of it somewhat. But you know, think broadly of how difficult it is to compete with these businesses. The second one is how much rivalry there is within the industry. And so with the airlines, I think this is a weakness for this industry, a disadvantage because they're really competing. It's a high, you know, the worst industry of all, and not, you know, not to pick on Delta, Samir, but the worst industry of all is thin margins, heavy capital requirements, and a lot of intense rivalry. And that's essentially the airline industry. It's about as bad as you can get. And, you know, tough labor negotiations, you know, everything you can think bad, the airline industry has that. They definitely have some growth prospects because of China and the emerging countries. Their people are starting to travel. Peoples in those countries are starting to travel more, but it is not a great industry from that standpoint. So there's a lot of rivalry within the industry. The other issue you have with the airlines is a lot of governments actually subsidize their airlines. You might think about that with some of the other industries. You know, if you think about, no one's doing Boeing, but Boeing competes with Airbus, and the French government does subsidize Airbus somewhat. There's a lot of airlines that are subsidized by different countries. So, if you have a lot of industry rivalry, you actually have governments that are propping up bad companies, and that's really bad for industry rivalry. That's unattractive for an industry. Some industries like Lululemon and Nike, I don't think that rivalry is quite as intense because those are very differentiated markets. So when you have strong differentiation, where it's really obvious, they do this, we do this, they do that, the rivalry is not that intense. They're all very clearly differentiated. So that would definitely be an advantage. Now, Alejandro, you're doing FedEx. You got FedEx, UPS, and now Amazon Prime. I don't know how intense the competition is there. You got Uber sitting out on the side and Lyft that might compete in there as well. You know, so I don't know the answer on some of these, you know, but read and see what MarketLine says. I think on some of these industries, I can almost argue either direction. One thing that does show rivalry within the industry, and again, this is something we could probably pull some data on. I haven't done it with the Excel I've done, but if you notice that gross margins are becoming thinner and thinner and thinner over time, Actually, I probably need to get out the UTSA again and bring in gross margins for your industries. That might be something Capital IQ could help you with. But that's a definite indicator that an industry has rivalry, that gross margins are getting thinner. Any questions on rivalry within the industry? Right, supplier power. If the suppliers have tremendous power over the industry, and usually if there's one big supplier or a couple of big suppliers, and you know they name the terms, they have a monopoly, you don't have much choice, that's unattractive for an industry. If there's a lot of suppliers, and that's probably the advantage Walmart has, and that's why I say their supply chain management is so important. They can shop for stuff all over the world. They're big enough. You know, they were at one time 25% of the retail world. I think Amazon's probably eating into that, but they can go all over the world, find suppliers. That gives them a huge, huge advantage. And they can somewhat dictate to suppliers, you know, if you don't want to deal with our terms, then we just won't put you on our shelves. That's a pretty big threat that they can do. So that gives them power. So on the retail side, there are a lot of suppliers. For Nike and Lululemon, supplier power, this is when you start talking about some of these emerging countries that are, you know, have these, you know, some of them have gotten in trouble for having sweatshops or having really unsafe work environments, very low wage, child labor, those type of things. There you look at those issues around those suppliers. What does that mean for the industry? Is it going to raise your costs because those are getting a lot of bad press? Those are the type of issues that you want to consider. Jose, you're doing Valero, and obviously the oil industry is your supplier. What kind of supply chain does Valero have? And I have no idea on that, but that'd be a really good thing to research. I'm sure there's an entire section in their annual report on that you could get some detail on. And Jose, you have inside information on that too, right? So you could actually.
Yeah, a little bit, yeah.
I mean, you can't use insider information in your paper, but I mean, inside knowledge, people you have access to. All right.
Yeah.
So supplier power can be raw materials. It can be finished products that you're buying and bringing along. If you're a firm like NVIDIA, where you don't actually produce anything, you're just inventing stuff, your suppliers is going to be your employees more than anything else. You know, airlines, you've got your employees, but you're also buying planes from Airbus and Boeing and Embraer and all these others. So, you know, those, so you'll have several sections. So supplier power can really be one of the longest sections of the paper, of paper one. Supplier power is also where you pick up the macro issues, those raw material prices. Maybe on Thursday night, I'll show you some way you can build charts on raw material prices, because there's a lot of resources out there where you can get really finite information on rubber prices, cotton prices, whatever you're using. Obviously, oil prices are out there, pretty available. So supplier, think about the major issues there. Don't get too minute here. So think about the major things. So that's again where I say get back to that value chain analysis. What's the most important input? The thing coming from outside the firm going into the firm that produces its end product. What are those most important things that drive either the firm's costs or its differentiation? So try to think through that. You need to read their business discussion in the annual report, and they'll give you some ideas on that. One other thing you can do is look at their cost of goods sold and go into their annual report and see if they've given you any details on their cost of goods sold. Because that's what we're talking about really, right? For the most part is what actually goes into the product. And firms do some funny things when they create cost of goods sold. For airlines, obviously fuel costs is a big issue, so you'd want to, you know, so fuel costs, Shamir, could definitely be one of your macro factors and put it under supplier power. But I want it under supplier power, so I don't want you talking about fuel costs and then come talk about supplier power. If you're going to talk about fuel costs, put it all under supplier power. Don't put it anywhere else in the paper.
Understood.
All right. Any questions on supplier power? I'm looking through your companies. So Alan on CarMax, used cars, right? I don't think CarMax sells new cars. So what is that supply chain for CarMax? I mean, I assume they go to all the auctions, but do they have some process that gives them an advantage over others? Are they is their supply chain any different than Carvana and AutoNation? Those are the kind of questions you want to ask. And if you can figure that out, you're adding tremendous value to the paper and to your boss.
Okay.
I'm not saying the answers are out there, so don't spend 80 hours and you can't find it. You may not be able to find it. I don't know what's available, but you know, at least ask those questions and look for them and see if you can find them. And again, that's why I say going to YouTube and looking for YouTube videos from your company. Now, one thing I need to point out here is, you know, I just talked about CarMax and supplier power. Remember on Porters, you're talking about the industry. So the reason I bring up CarMax is give you ideas to talk about the industry. So then you can say this industry, they get it from these auction houses. However, some of the players have a really good process where they do this. And so you want to really make sure you're focusing on the industry here and not focusing on your company. But if you bring out those issues in paper 1 and in paper 2, then it's a really good transition into paper 3, where you can say in paper 1 I talked about, or in a previous paper I talked about how certain firms in this industry source their raw materials this way. Well, my company does this, and it really fits together as a really strong paper. All right, anything else on supplier power? Curtis, I have no earthly idea on ATVI, so you're on your own on that. I've seen papers on that company before, but I can't remember. Alicia, you're doing Whirlpool, so you know what exactly did they buy? Where does the steel come from? Steel prices could be a big issue for Whirlpool, although I think they're using more aluminum and plastic now. Adobe. So what is Adobe going to do? Does Adobe actually build anything? Isn't it all software? So Adobe supplier power might be 100% employees, which is perfectly fine. All right, I'll keep going unless someone stops me. Thread of substitution. Oh, wait, missed a big one. Oh, buyer power. I can't actually see these because your pictures are in the way. All right, let me see if I can move this over. Buyer power. All right, so all of you will talk buyer power. So can your buyers dictate price? Are they so diverse that you know, you can say, hey, this is my price, take it or leave it. So you know, what kind of sway do buyers have? So those doing Lockheed and Honeywell, you're going to spend a lot of time here. You may go on a long discussion here about the U.S. military, the U.S. federal government budget, other nations' budgets, what they're spending. So in this paper, that might be their long, you know, along with supplier power, might be the longest part of the paper. If they're doing well, there's no one doing aerospace outside of military. And we're talking earlier about Procter and Gamble. So who is their buyers? So think about that. You might think Procter and Gamble, where the buyer is the household, but you can talk that angle. You can certainly talk about the household and how brand specific they are. But you also have the buyer of the retail outlets, the Walmarts, the Costco's. So you need to talk about that as well. So if you're an in-between firm like a Procter and Gamble, you really have two buyers. You have the household and you have the stores that are actually the in-between. So you need to talk about both of those. And differentiate your buyers. So if I'm doing airlines, I want to do business travel, leisure travel, you know, the different price points. So if you can differentiate your buyers into different groups, that works really well in here. And what are they looking for? What is the business travel they're looking for versus the leisure travel? I remember my boss, he traveled as expensively as he possibly could for work, because then he got his air miles, and then he would take his family on vacation as cheaply as possible. And it always bothered me, but that's the way he did it. And it's like, yeah. But they're very different groups of people. When someone else is paying your pain, you tend to spend more. You tend not to be price sensitive. Netflix, your buyer is the people subscribing to you, but we don't have anybody doing Facebook or Google. So I use Facebook, but I am not a buyer of Facebook. The buyers of Facebook are the advertisers. So make sure you're talking about a buyer. For Facebook, I'm a supplier for Facebook. I'm not a buyer. I'm just a user on there. They don't pay me anything. I don't pay them anything. I pay them with my data, right? That's how I pay them. So be real careful who is the actual buyer. Your buyer is someone who cuts your firm a check or sends your company money. So be really, really clear on that. Who's actually spending the money? Valero, Jose, that's a little different now, right? Since they sold off Corner Store, and so it's a little bit different. But it's a little tricky, and you probably understand that better than I do. But it's a little tricky exactly what arrangement they have now. And now that Corner Store got bought out, it's getting a little bit confusing. But really think about who is the actual buyer here. Where's the cash flow coming from? Some of y'all be easier. Starbucks, CarMax, a little easier. Costco, it's pretty obvious. It's the household. It's the retail consumer. If it's a retail, I'm sorry.
Professor Sweet, because the real buyer, would I go with like companies, industries that use their product to power their big machinery, or because they also have gas stations, and because the big money comes from selling to the industry for machinery.
Yeah, if you can distinguish the buyers into groups. One thing, and unfortunately, since we don't have access to Bloomberg, one thing that Bloomberg does really well, maybe Capital IQ will, and so I really need to start testing it myself. But Bloomberg has a really good segments section. Now, your annual report of your firm will have a segments. So let your firm define that. So Jose, okay. I don't know if you look at Valero and see what segments they actually list in the annual report, but try to start there.
Okay.
Some firms will define segments as U.S., Latin America, Europe. So you may have a geographic distinction, and that can be really important. And I would think Procter and Gamble, an international kind of how much they sell in Africa versus the U.S. versus Europe would be a good way to do that. So on buyer power, here's where you can do a lot of your macro analysis. So if you're a retail outlet, or anything that's consumer discretionary, especially consumer discretionary spending, what is take-home pay? And those are really easy. One thing I really like to do, and I might try to set some of these up in a future class just to show you how I do it. I used to be kind of humorously the chief economist at UTSA just because their economist quit. He didn't have enough to do. So I had to do these economic presentations. And one thing I really like to do was a contrast the take-home pay of consumers to consumer debt. So I wanted to see is our incomes growing at 3% and consumer debt is growing at 7%, and how long can we keep that going? A lot of that happened before the 2008 crisis, where people were increasing debt based on home prices, but their incomes weren't rising, and then suddenly we had a disaster. I think COVID-19 has gone the opposite way. People are not spending that $1,200, they're actually saving it. And so we're going the other direction. But look at the consumer's ability to buy stuff. So it's consumer income. There's several statistics you can look at that. Retail sales is another good one to look at. I like to take retail sales and adjust it for inflation because sometimes retail sales go up just because inflation's higher. But anything you can look at that gives you the strength of the consumer. If you want to talk about unemployment here, if you're a retail, I wouldn't look at unemployment if I was doing Procter and Gamble, but if I was doing CarMax or doing Delta Air, yeah, unemployment's important, especially for Delta Air. The business traveler is pretty important. So if there's a lot of people unemployed, obviously business travel is going to be cut back. So, on the buyer power, there's a lot of macro analysis that you can pull. If you're selling to an industrial firm, industrial production is a really good statistic to use, and that's very easy to get your hands on too. Forget stuff. My brain is just the PMI indicator that comes out the first every month. That's a really good one to use if your buyer is another company. So like your Deere or your oh man, we don't have many that are selling to other firms, but NVIDIA, maybe Texas Instruments, you're selling to other firms, then yeah, the PMI, those type of indicators, Texas Instruments and NVIDIA, the book to sell ratio, book to bill ratio is really, really good. That gives you some indication of, are they keeping up with their product demand? How strong is demand? So there are ratios that really work well. So a lot of students use buyer power as their main focus. Well, supplier power and buyer power are their main focus for the macro analysis. There's so much you can do there. So if you're not sure, call me and I can give you all kinds of ideas. I'm gotten pretty knowledgeable on what kind of economic data is available, because I did those economic presentations for about 5 years in a row. And so there's a lot of stuff available that's pretty amazing that you can get into Excel in a few seconds. All right. So think about whether so for the buyer power, if the U.S. consumer is weak, their incomes are down, their take-home pay is down, they're unemployed, that's unattractive for the industry. Whatever Congress is doing to try to help people out, that's going to be part of that. So a lot of time you're just looking at your buyer and say, is your buyer in distress? If your buyer is in distress, then that is a weak industry. Growth is going to be hampered for some time until your buyer gets back on their feet. Any questions on buyer power? That should be probably a good chunk of your paper as well. All right, I'm not hearing any questions. I'm trying to look at your companies and seeing if anything. So, all right, threat of substitutes. This one's a tough one. So let me just make it really clear. Lululemon is not a substitute for Nike. They're in the same industry. So a substitute comes from outside the industry. All right, sorry I keep picking on airlines, but airlines is one that's easy to talk about. So airlines, autonomous vehicles is a substitute for airlines. I forget what they call that thing. We're going to shoot people in some kind of cone through the belly of the earth at 500 miles an hour. I can't remember what that's called, but that's a substitute for airlines. So CarMax, the same way. I'm sorry?
Would a substitute for like cars be like public transportation?
It could be if there's something major going on there. I think autonomous vehicles could be a substitute. Even though people will be driving cars, they may not be driving cars they own. So the substitute is, instead of buying a car for myself, I'll just use rideshare and use an autonomous vehicle, because the cost will be so much lower. So that's definitely a threat. So think about something that's outside of the industry that threatens the industry. Some of your industries will not have that. Now, Valero, obviously, electric vehicles. So, Jose, I think you're going to have to talk sometime about electric vehicles. Maybe Valero is doing gasoline and liquid gas, liquefied natural gas. But if we go to electric vehicles, maybe liquefied natural gas is something they could get into that game, right? And they could be part of the energy grid. But what happened? I don't know if Valero is scared to death about electric vehicles, but the growth rate in electric vehicles is really high. As battery prices come down, electric vehicles will soon be cheaper than gas vehicles and more reliable and will last longer. It's almost like the death of the gas car could be, within the next 15 years or so. So that is a threat, a substitute threat. So Lululemon, Nike, it's hard for me to think of a substitute threat. FedEx, Alejandro, you might be able to talk about Uber and Lyft as being substitution threats. That's kind of a different animal outside of the industry. Ecolabs, Richard, Christie, it's hard for me to think of a substitute for cleaning chemicals. in Curtis ATVI, and yeah, I don't know that industry well enough to say if digital online is a substitute or not. That's a tough one. Netflix, I don't know, Jacob, if you think about a substitute threat there. Obviously, Netflix was a substitution threat for Blockbuster. So what would be a substitution threat? So Disney is not a substitution threat for Netflix, all right? So just make sure you're really clear on that. Starbucks, I can't think of substitute, restaurants. You could, I guess, if you wanted to, all of you doing Starbucks and DJs, home delivery, maybe, but I don't know. I think that's just another way of them delivering the same product. So I don't know. Think about it. If you're not sure, talk to me. Don't feel obligated. You have to talk about that section though. So Oscar and Constellation brands. You definitely could distinguish between, and I don't know anything about beer at all, but the craft, whatever the small time growers are versus the big time. But I think marijuana would be a substitution threat. That definitely makes sense. I don't know if e-cigarettes would be, but definitely marijuana would be. I can't think of the good term for marijuana off the top of my head. So cannabis, yeah, cannabis would be a substitution threat. Costco, I don't really know. Pepsi, Coca-Cola, they're already doing energy drinks. They're already doing water. They're already doing, I don't know. I'm not sure what else there is that can really substitute. But definitely soy is a substitution for milk, but no one's selling milk in this group. Adobe, I have no earthly idea, so you just got to think through it. Apple, think through it. So I'm not always sure. Here's where MarketLine can help you because they'll have substitution threats there. So let them help you get some ideas on that. But just remember, on substitution threats, you can say not applicable for my industry, and you're done on that. All right, so there's Porter's 5 forces. Any questions on those 5 forces? If I were you, I'd try to get this section written this week as much as possible, or at least have an outline of what you're going to talk about under each one. And then you start fleshing it out. Once you know what you're going to talk about, I think you're going to find that after you read a while, you have some good quotes. I think you're going to find writing it gets really fast. You've read about it, it's interesting, you've really thought about it, you found some good articles. You can almost just write it off the top of your head. Find some good charts to put in there. That always helps with this section. But I think you'll find it will start writing itself pretty quickly once you have the outline. So really focus on what am I going to put under each one of these things. If you want to use the MarketLine's charts, you can. What I would ask you to do is make it really clear. See how I don't like this, weak and strong. Does that mean buyer power is weak, so it's good for the industry? I don't know. I get so confused on these charts. So change your terminology from weak and strong to advantageous, disadvantageous, or positive and negative, whatever. All right, make it really clear. I look at these charts, I have no idea what the student's saying because I can't remember how MarketLine defines these. Or you can just leave them out because I don't care much for them anyway, but anyway. All right. I don't know if I want to start this next section. Y'all should be asking me questions here. So,
Professor Sweet.
Uh-huh.
So, like for my Constellation brands, I think that buyer power is going to be a big one. The U.S. consumer and like restaurants and stuff for alcohol.
Definitely.
So,
yeah.
I mean, I guess I could give like the latest projections, like. We might come back 100% by next April per se or something like that. But if that changes over the semester, you'll have to go back and like rewrite it.
Yeah, that's a challenge. We're doing something over 3 months you normally do in a week. So if you write paper 1 and things change, you can either just assume things didn't change and stick with it, or you can have a paper that's not internally consistent. The challenge with it not being internally consistent, you put on LinkedIn, they may notice that, and so you have that risk. But I'll leave it up to you. There's no way to get around. There's no obvious answer to that, so you just have to do. one thing that you mentioned there, though, Zachary, I think is important under buyer power. You might not think it fits here, but I do think it fits here, and that's buyer taste changes. If people aren't drinking alcohol, you know, your generation's not drinking alcohol the way my generation does, I would put that under buyer power. Changing attitudes, changing taste, that works really well under buyer power.
Could you put it under both buyer power and threat substitution, just touching on different aspects or whatever?
Yeah, you could put it under either, but yeah, if there's changes, like let's say Lululemon mainly sells to, I have no earthly idea, but mainly they sell to women ages 18 to 40. And you go out and get the demographics and you discover that age group is not growing all that fast around the world, I would put that under buyer power, not under substitution threat. So if I'm trying to make the point that millennials don't buy beer as much as older groups, I might put that under buyer power as a demographic macro factor. But it could fit under substitution if you know what they're going to. If they're going to cannabis, or if your generation's just healthier or whatever. But it could fit under either one. Just make it logical so it fits.
Hey, Professor.
Uh-huh.
If I define the industry of car sales as only used car sales, would a threat of like a substitute be new car sales?
I think you could do that here. Yeah, and I think especially in something you could really work into the buyer power, and you've probably already seen the statistics, is how old the U.S. car is right now. It's pretty amazing how old used cars are. And there's some statistics. Once cars get, you know, there's a big hang-up, a big kind of balloon around cars around 6-7 years old. And people do start replacing with new cars after that point in time. So it might be a bad time for CarMax. So yeah, I mean, you can certainly put that under substitution. It would fit as well under buyer power, so either one is fine on that. It's a little strange, I think, to say new cars are a substitute for used car. I think, see what Market Line does. I doubt they do that. I think they're probably more focused. I think autonomous vehicles definitely fit.
Okay.
Now, electric vehicles, you know, there's no reason why CarMax can't sell electric vehicles. So, you know, I wouldn't consider that a substitute. Other questions y'all have? Here's somewhere where I would outline it if you want to call me or send me your outline, and, you know, I just want to bounce off some ideas. You know, I definitely try to get this week. I'm just looking at the calendar and how this paper comes along. It looks like you got a lot of time for this paper, but you really want to spread it out. And the best thing you can do in this first paper is get it outlined really, really strong. If you do and I encourage you all to do an outline. Don't just, I've had students write papers just free form, just straight, sit down without an outline, and boy, you can really tell it just doesn't fit together very well. All right, so what I want to do next class is I want to show how you work in cost leadership and differentiation in the papers 1 and 2, and then focus it more for paper 3. And then I want to talk about economic moats. Economic moats is mainly a paper 3 item, but there are some things in economic moats, like switching costs, like platform, that really fit well in paper 1. So I want to show them to you, and you can fit them into both papers definitely. So I'll stop it there, but I'll stay on as long as y'all want. If you have individual questions, so up to y'all how you want to do it. Any other questions? Kind of class level questions? And if not, you know, you're free to get off at any time.